Hi everyone, I hope you're having just an absolutely wonderful day. I'm super excited for today's video because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite gardening topics, amaryllis aside, and that is cool flowers. And this book, Cool Flowers by Lisa Mason Ziegler, not only revolutionized the way that I garden, but also made a huge impact on how I sell cut flowers and the amount of cut flowers that I am able to sell. So almost everything that we're going to be talking about today can be found in Lisa's wonderful book, Cool Flowers. I would highly recommend you seek this book out from your local library, from an extension office near you. They'll often let you borrow the books there. And I'll also put a link to Lisa's book in the description section below. So let's first talk about what is a cool flower, also known as a hardy annual. Cool flowers are still annual flowers, meaning they complete their life cycle over the course of a year. But unlike warm season annuals, which basically are growing in the heat and humidity of summer, cool season annuals thrive in cool conditions. They are literally cold, hardy plants. And just like we're used to perennials having a hardiness zone, all annuals have a hardiness zone as well. And this is especially important to know when talking about cool flowers because it will directly influence which flowers you plant in the garden at what point in the growing season. So if a cool flower is hardy in your zone, it can be fall planted 6 to 8 weeks before the first expected fall frost. What will happen is these plants will develop into baby plants. They'll have a really healthy, robust root system. They'll be small plants that are able to overwinter. They'll just sit there over the course of the winter, just like a perennial plant that's hardy in your zone. But then when temperatures are right in spring, they will literally just take off. And because we planted them at the ideal time, the time that they want to be planted, we're going to have healthier plants, much taller plants, bigger stems, more florets on the flower itself, and overall the plant health will be healthier because basically these plants are not having to deal with pests and diseases so early on in the season, or they're much stronger so they're able to combat any pests and disease that might come their way. So that's fall planting. But say a cool flower is not hardy in your zone, then you can still plant it in very early spring, 6 to 8 weeks before the last expected frost. And everyone can do that no matter what zone you're in. And you'll still end up with a healthier plant that's planted during the time of year when it wants to grow. It enjoys cool conditions. So now that we've talked about what a cool flower is and the 2 planting windows, let's dive a little bit more into the 4 things you need to know before you get started planting cool flowers. First, you need to know what is your winter hardiness zone. I'm here in a zone 6B, southern Pennsylvania, so I'm really looking at all the cool flowers that are hardy to zone 6 and lower for fall planting. I also need to know the hardiness zone of all the cool flowers so that I can determine which flowers I can fall plant. And then the other 2 pieces of information I need is my first and last expected frost date. But don't get too hung up on finding the exact date because you will see some variation based on what website you look into, and this date changes over the course of many years. Just go with a general sense of when your first and last expected frost date is. Ours is said to be about October 24th here in southern Pennsylvania, so I always just use Halloween as my first expected frost date, and I count back about 6 weeks, and that lands me right in the middle of September. But the one other thing I'm looking at is really the nighttime temperatures. I want the nighttime temperatures to be in the mid-60s, and that's what really tells me that it's time to get cool flowers in the garden. So now we have the question of whether to direct plant cool flower seeds in the ground or whether to plant them out as transplants. And if we're going to have a transplant to go out into the garden 6 to 8 weeks before the first frost, we probably need to be starting that seed inside about 6 weeks prior to that. So for me here in my Zone 6B garden, where my first expected frost is Halloween, my plant out day is mid-September, I'm looking at mid-August to start my cool flower transplants. But how I determine whether or not I'm going to directly sow a cool flower into the garden versus starting a transplant inside is completely dependent on what is best for that particular flower. What is going to give me the best and highest success rate with that flower? So things that I always direct sow into the garden, that Grace and I always direct sow into the garden, are Larkspur, Nigella, Bachelor buttons, Bupleurum, Bells of Ireland, Saponaria, Forget-Me-Not, and did I say Orlaya yet? If not, Orlaya. Now of all of those seeds, only 5 are winter hardy in my zone. So the ones that I can direct sow in the fall here in Zone 6B are Bupleurum, Nigella, Larkspur, Orlaya, and Bachelor's buttons. The other ones I need to wait until very early spring, 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost, to direct sow those into the garden, because things like Forget-Me-Nots, Bells of Ireland, and Saponaria are not winter hardy in my zone, meaning that their likelihood of surviving my winter is slim to none. Now on the flip side, some seeds just do better started inside as transplants. Things like Snapdragons, Yarrow, Feverfew, Sweet William, I prefer to start all of those things inside about 6 weeks before I want to plant them out into the garden. So for a fall planting, I'm looking at really that hot point in the summer, about the beginning of August, when I'm starting a lot of cool flowers under lights. And that kind of brings me to a question that comes up all the time. Why are we planting out transplants on the same day that we're direct seeding cool flowers? And that's basically because they both still need that establishment period to get settled into the garden setting before they go through the winter. And I think there is a little bit more wiggle room with transplants, but still I wouldn't want to put a transplant out, say 1 week before the first expected frost, before those roots really have a chance to root into the garden soil, and before that plant has a chance to become accustomed to the temperature swings, and really basically just get established. But it is the same planting date. Transplants and direct seeding happen on the same exact date. So now let's direct seed some cool flowers together. This first planting is going to be all of the giant imperial larkspur. Larkspur does take a long time to germinate, so don't worry if you don't see it right away. Sometimes it will take almost an entire month to germinate. Planting depth on larkspur is 1/8 of an inch. For this planting, I'm going to plant in rows so that it's very easy to hoe in between the rows, but we'll also go over to my flower borders and we'll broadcast them there and talk about how to have success with broadcast seeding as well. So whenever I'm direct seeding in my gardens, whether that be in a raised bed or in the flower borders, first thing, if it's in the border, I always want to remove the mulch, and then I want to work the soil a bit so that it's really nice and crumbly. I don't want to direct sow any seeds into hard, compacted soil. I just won't have good germination in those conditions. So I work the soil, I weed the bed really well. Then I make sure that I'm able to have water easily running to this bed, whether that's irrigation, whether I bring a hose over here. I need to keep the seed bed moist at all times until germination occurs. Now once I have the area all worked, I'm going to go ahead and make these little tiny trenches based on how deep the seed needs to go. In this bed, which is a 4-foot wide bed, I'm going to do 4 rows, and I'm going to leave enough room in between the rows so that I can easily get my garden hoe in between them. Now I'll just take my seed, and another thing is that when I direct seed anything, I very heavily overseed the area. So I might end up thinning these Larkspur to about 4 inches apart. I do like to grow my cool flowers very close together, especially spikes, so say 4 to 6 inches. But I'm going to sow a seed at least every inch. I'm probably sowing 4 times more seeds in the garden than I want to actually end up with by the time we are hoeing these beds in about a month and a half. And the number one question people ask me, definitely, I meet people in this area or I talk to people on the internet, when are these plants blooming? And that is going to vary depending on when you plant them, your zone, your climate, everything. But for me, here in Zone 6B, Southern Pennsylvania, where I guess I could say this might be helpful, our last frost is mid-April. These are blooming the last week of May into June. And I think sometimes people have this same question, but they'll say, well, do these bloom along with the tulips or do they bloom along with the peonies? For me, these do not bloom along with the tulips. I sell tulips all on their own, and only a few of them are blooming alongside the peonies. If you grow the Sweet series of Sweet William, not the Amazon series, Amazon blooms a little bit later, but if you grow Sweet, they will generally bloom alongside the peonies here in Southern Pennsylvania. I can only speak to what happens here. And also you'll have some Bachelor buttons, some Nigella, but it's really just that the cool flowers are just getting started because, as I say, they're really kicking into gear the last week of May, but they're really not in full bloom until the 1st and 2nd week of June. Now I'm just going to cover the seeds over with 1/8 of an inch of soil. Tamp that down for good seed to soil contact. For me, the biggest challenge, especially with some of these cool flowers that take a really long time to germinate, is just making sure to water the bed every day. Almost have to make it part of my daily routine to come out here and water them, because even if this bed goes a day or 2 without water, that's really going to affect my germination rate. So what I like to do is just make it part of my daily routine, whether that's as soon as I get home from dropping my daughter off at school, maybe I'm coming out here even earlier with my coffee, just making it a habit to make sure that these seeds remain moist until germination occurs. And then once these sprout, I have enough room to come through with my garden hoe and take care of the weeds. Now we'll go ahead and sow some Bupleurum and some Nigella. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but I like to prepare my beds right before I plant into them. If I were to prepare the beds, say 2 weeks prior to planting out, that would mean that the weed seeds that are in this bed, no matter how good I weed it, have 2 weeks head start on all my cool flowers. So I really like to prepare the beds right before I plant into them. So for this, we're going to do half Nigella, half Bupleurum, and we're just going to broadcast the seed. So basically it means just scattering the seed heavily on the soil surface, and then I'll cover them with soil as required by that particular seed. So for this, I'll just go ahead and sprinkle the seeds on the ground. If I missed a weed, I'll pull it up as I go. I've got the Nigella in, so I'll move on to the Bupleurum. I'm gonna just push a little bit of soil over to the side and use this soil to cover my seeds, just to make it a little easier for myself. Just sprinkle my Bupleurum seeds from about 2 feet above the bed. I'm holding my hand, I guess you could say. So I'm trying to get a nice even distribution of the seed, but very heavy coverage on this seed. And my hope here is that the Bupleurum will win out over any weeds that are in this area, although I picked this bed in particular for broadcasting because I know I don't have a big chickweed problem in this bed like I do in some other beds. And then I'm just using this hoop to separate my Bupleurum from my Nigella planting. Also, one thing that I learned the hard way is to really watch the weather like a hawk when you do this. We have lots of rain here, and the rain comes down quite heavily. So I'm just covering this with about 1/4 of an inch of soil now. The rain is really heavy, and a lot of times my seeds will get washed all around. And if you recall, that happened last year, and I ended up with a mixture of seed all throughout the bed, which ended up working out, but that's not my hope. My hope is to keep the crops separated. But really, here on in terms of the fall, it's just all about keeping these seed beds moist all the time. I want to keep on top of the weeds, but I have planted these seeds so heavily that the seedlings should be able to outcompete the weeds, since basically I weeded the bed and worked the bed on the same day that I planted the seeds. Fingers crossed. Now let's go ahead and plant some cool flowers in one of my borders. So when I'm planting cool flowers in a flower border, the first thing I want to do is make sure and get rid of the mulch from that area and get rid of the weeds. The catmint is a little bit out of control at this point, and it won't be this big come spring. So I'm actually going to come in and cut the catmint back also before I direct seed. Of course, I've got some tree of heaven trying to grow in here. So I'll just cover these Larkspur seeds up with a bit of soil because they want darkness to germinate. Now we'll just water these in and make sure to keep them moist until germination occurs in a few weeks' time. Well, friends, it just feels wonderful to have some cool flowers in the ground, and I'll be continuing to plant out cool flowers this week. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, if you're confused about this topic, I completely understand that. At least for me, this topic was something that prior to reading Lisa's book, I had never heard about before. And it was so hard for me to believe that I could plant something so close to the first frost and it would survive over the winter season. But this group of plants has really brought so much value and so much joy to my life as well. Over the course of this video and all the videos I've done, I've really stressed how planting cool flowers results in a better quality plant overall. But I also think it brings value to us as gardeners as well, because we're back out into the garden when it's just much more comfortable to be out here. The temperatures are more in the 70s, the bugs are starting to go away, or in the spring, thank goodness they're not even there at all. And it just gives us a whole other season of gardening to enjoy. And I'm sure if you're here on my channel, you just love gardening, you love cut flowers. Why not add this additional season of cut flowers into your garden, or into your bouquet subscriptions, into your market flowers, wherever you find yourself in life. Now, I think there's two questions that I wanted to answer, which I didn't talk about yet while we were planting. The first one, which I saw a lot on an older video I did, was when do I thin these plants? Because we so heavily seeded them, they're certainly going to need to be thinned. So I don't thin cool flowers until very early spring. So right as I'm going out into the garden to sow the flowers that weren't winter hardy in my zone, I'm really going to assess what my fall planted flowers look like and go ahead and thin them at that time. And the reason why I wait that long to thin them is because a lot of things can happen over the winter season. I've lost a number of plants to sitting in water and drowning over the winter. Sometimes you have animals get into your bed, maybe they lay on the plants and crush them, maybe they dig them up. There's a whole host of things that can happen over the winter season. So I like to kind of let that play out and then thin them in very early spring. Kind of along that same vein, I saw a question about what to do about animals getting into your bed. Now, this isn't something that I do anymore, but the only thing I can really think of to do is to go ahead and cover them with hoops and frost cloth and basically prevent critters from getting into your freshly planted beds by basically just covering them so that they don't even have the option. Now you can also buy yourself a whole nother zone by covering cool flowers. Sometimes people will say, oh, I just heard about this concept, but it's 5 weeks before the first frost, or it's 4 weeks before the first frost. Can I still go ahead and plant cool flowers? And the best way I can think about the best thing that I can think of to do is to go ahead, plant them still, just to go ahead and get a feel for the experience, but definitely hoop and row cover that bed with agribon to get some more heat in that area and essentially buy yourself a whole nother growing zone. Now, the only reason that I don't use hoops and row covers anymore, and there's a whole section I think in Lisa's book about hoops and row covers, is that in my particular climate, it rains all the time, and in the winter it will rain, ice, and then snow. The snow is sometimes a really heavy snow load. I've seen snow loads up to here where my daughter's just laying on the snow next to me and we're worried about the roof and everything like that. And so years when I did use hoops and row covers over the winter, what was happening to me is that no matter how many hoops I put in, inevitably the agribon would collapse under the weight of the snow and ice. Basically, then it would fall in, touch my transplants, get iced onto the transplants, and at the end of the day, I would end up losing all of those plants. And so what I've discovered is, for my particular climate, and this could be totally different somewhere else, but for my climate, I actually find it detrimental to use hoops and row covers. So I no longer try to hoop and row cover anything. I don't try to buy another zone for myself by doing that, because I've seen that happen a few years in a row and I just don't feel like it's worth it. The whole point of this is for it to be fun, to make life easy and more profitable at the end of the day. And when all of that was happening, it was just kind of having the opposite effect. Well, friends, I sure hope this video was helpful. I hope you have a wonderful day out there in your gardens, and I'll see you sometime real soon. Bye!